Just as I spread my branches, I came to a realization. What was truly astounding was that the victims knew what was happening and why. They understood fossil fuels were to blame and understood they were capable of preventing what was to come. However, power did not reside in the hands of these people who had a clear understanding of the climate. Instead, political, economic, and social institutions, with a strong interest in maintaining the use of fossil fuels, held nearly all the power. These groups comprised the Carbon Combustion Complex, a network of powerful industries comprised of fossil fuel producers, drilling and oil companies, large construction companies, transportation manufacturers in the automobile and aviation industries, financial institutions that service their capital demands, and advertising, marketing, and public relations firms that promoted these companies' products. Scientists, however, valiantly continued their work in their quest to save the world from impending disaster, but their efforts were squandered due to a powerful ideological system at the time labeled market fundamentalism. According to market fundamentalism, society was served most efficiently through a free market economic system, and all other manners of economic distribution presented an immediate threat to the individual's personal freedom. This emphasis on the protection of both personal and economic liberty, including the tenet that one could not survive without the other, harkened back to the 18th century. During the 18th century, power resided with cruel, unjust, and often incompetent rulers. Thus, individual liberty was perceived to be of paramount importance. This burning desire for independence gave rise to the American and French revolutions, but these ideals proved difficult to enforce in practice. Slavery continued in the United States till the mid-19th century, and the French Revolution eventually led to the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte as another autocratic ruler. Later in the 19th century, industrialists began to take advantage of the free markets and seize power for themselves. These newfound weaknesses of capitalism gave rise to Marxism and communism, particularly in countries like Russia, China, Vietnam, Ghana, and Cuba. Most other non-communist countries also began enforcing stricter economic governance, including taxes, tariffs, regulation of banks and exchanges, and antitrust laws.
Following the end of the Second World War, tensions between free market societies and communist states were extremely high. The United States and other European powers were fearful of Russian communism influence into weaker, recovering nations, and looked to limit its spread through proving the superiority of capitalistic markets. Westerners looked to highlight the flaws of communism, as countries like Russia and China failed to deliver goods and services to their people, and millions of their citizens lived in poverty. The polarization of communism in Western nations helped give rise to a new train of political ideology led by philosophers Friedrich von Hayek and Milton Friedman called neoliberalism. The new way of thinking was built around the old idea that free market systems were the only economic systems that did not threaten the individual liberty of the people. Although remaining a minority view during the economic prosperity of the 1950s and 1960s, neoliberal ideas grew in popularity as markets turned for the worse in the early 70s. And politicians like Ronald Reagan began to preach their rhetoric, asking for a smaller centralized American government and less government influence. These ideas were enwrapped in the 1990s as the decade saw the widespread deregulation of financial markets, as well as the removal of environmental protection legislation. Although early neoclassical philosophers like von Hayek spoke of an important interconnection between free markets and science, this idea began to fade with time. As scientists spoke more and more of the arising environmental problems, politicians and the empowered wealthy elites began to push science further to the side. Although evidence of acid rain and climate change and the depletion of the ozone layer were quite clear, politicians who questioned the evidence were able to raise doubt in the minds of citizens, and this proved to be the biggest setback to the fight against the destruction of the earth. Policies oriented towards limiting human emissions were framed as attacks against the personal freedoms of the people. The rise of neoliberalism, based off the premise of limiting government influence and protecting the individual rights, had the unintended effect of acting as a barrier to preventing the salvation of the planet.
The longtime critics claimed that the costs to remove greenhouse gas emission from our atmosphere were too high and believed that it would cost more than it was worth. Other countries tried to force the United States into international cooperation, which forced the U.S. to be held accountable for their actions. The United States, however, allowed their business interests to dominate public policy. The United States excused their own patterns of destructive development by arguing the inertia within their economy which prevented them from changing their economic output and thus their greenhouse gas emissions. As the millennium came to a close, denial spread widely. The President of the United States and Congress both denied any knowledge of the emission of greenhouse gases and the harm it was doing to the atmosphere. The U.S. argued against these accusations by claiming that other countries were trying to oppress their development. Other countries such as China took precaution to control their economy and enforce the use of produced non-carbon-based energy sources.
Now that you understand how we got here, I would like to tell you what caused this disaster. Today, the year is 2093 and the world has degraded into a dismal state. CO2 emissions have risen to unprecedented levels, and following the great collapse and mass migration between 2073 and 2093, the planet has been reshaped such that it is unrecognizable compared to 100 years ago. In order to understand how the world came to be this desolate shell of its former self, we must start by looking as far back as the Industrial Revolution of the 18th century. The signs were all there. The warning signals were clear. But the people of the time failed to act upon the robust information and damaging events that were about to unfold. Unwilling to accept the imminent reality rapidly approaching, the men and women of the 18th through 21st century nearly brought about their own demise. The first major raise in CO2 was the three-stage Industrial Revolution, first in the UK in 1750 to 1850, then in Germany, the US, Europe, and Japan from 1850 to 1980, and finally in China, India, and Brazil from 1980 to 2050. In the 1960s, the situation progressed with the addition of DDTs and CFCs to the environment. People understood that anthropogenic CO2 increases were happening. However, since the emissions were so low, they were relatively unconcerned and allowed it to continue. The ozone layer began to be depleted in the 1970s. Although astute observations were being made, it was rare for the scientists to make the correlation between the data and the widespread effects of global warming. Eventually, in the 1980s to 1990s, people started to acknowledge the need for a response and added in major research programs and created Earth Day. They then started to take governmental action and created the Environmental Protection Agency, as well as the UNFCCC, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which was signed by the UN. All of these actions formalized the need to pay attention to and protect the environment. In 1988, the penumbral period, a time marked by the anti-intellectualism that fell over the once enlightened and technologically advanced Western nations, began. The world took action. It seemed to recognize the crisis at hand, and it was working towards implementing a solution.
Physical scientists who spoke out about the potentially catastrophic effects of climate change were accused of being alarmist and of acting out in self-interest, to increase financial support for their enterprise, gain attention, or improve their social standing. These scientists were faced with public humiliation, but this quickly turned far more serious, as they began to find their lives filled with death threats, thefts, and the release of private and personal correspondence. The scientific community's work, specifically regarding human effects of climate change, started to be suppressed, and the United States government began to pass legislation on what scientists could study. This limitation began with House Bill 819, otherwise known as the Sea Level Rise Denial Bill, and the Government Spending Accountability Act of 2012, which restricted the ability of scientists to share their research. The Sea Level Rise Denial Bill would become the model for U.S. National Stability Protection Act of 2015, which would lead to the imprisonment of more than 300 scientists for endangering the safety and well-being of the public with exaggerated and alarming threats. The government argued that scientists were preventing economic development, which was essential for dealing with the problem of climate change. Despite protests from the scientists, the United States Supreme Court ruled that the government had the right to limit free speech if it represented a threat under the clear and present danger doctrine. By 2012, more than 365 billion tons of carbon had been emitted to the atmosphere from the burning of fossil fuels and from the production of cement. Some of this increase was understandable, as previously underdeveloped nations began to industrialize. But what was not understandable was why wealthy nations increased their production of fossil fuels just as climate change was beginning to become apparent. At the forefront of this problem was America and Canada. A turning point in this increase came in 2005, when the United States Energy Policy Act exempted shale gas drilling from regulatory oversight under the Safe Drinking Water Act, which would cause America to massively increase its shale gas production. Canada followed the lead of the United States and also began to promote the extraction of shale gas. Besides driving up direct emissions of both CO2 and CH4 to the atmosphere, the resulting massive increase in supply of natural gas led to a collapse in the market price, driving out renewable energy industries everywhere except China, where government subsidies and protection for fledgling industries enabled the renewable energy sector to flourish. To further the spread of natural gas, the United States government banned biodiesel fuels on the federal and state levels. Bills were particularly hard on the highly regulated electricity generation industry. For example, politicians blocked the sale of electric cars in such a way that fossil fuel companies maintained control over energy production and use. During this time, Arctic sea ice melted, and new seaways opened that permitted oil and gas reserves to be accessed in the North Polar region. By 2010, Arctic summer sea had lost about 30% of areal extent. 2007 was a particularly notable year as the Northwest Passage opened and the polar seas became traversable for the first time in recorded history. While governments had the ability to stop the spread of fossil fuels, they only encouraged it, often sponsoring activities such as exploration in the Russian Arctic by American oil giant Exxon in exchange for American technology trade to the Russians in 2012.
During this period, the idea of natural gas as a bridge to renewable energy developed. Essentially, people believed that shale could bridge the gap between conventional oil and gas resources and renewable fuels. Although natural gas became widely popular, it was not without its problems. Fugitive emissions escaped from the atmosphere and greatly accelerated global warming. On another level, gas was meant to be used in electricity to replace coal, but instead it became cheaper and replaced nuclear and hydropower energy. Additionally, scientists ignored the fact that aerosols from coal actually cooled temperatures and kept them down. Most importantly, the rise of natural gas reinforced the previous system of fossil fuel dependencies and weakened emerging markets of biofuels, wind, and solar energy. During this era, fossil fuel production and greenhouse gas emissions increased, and climate disruption accelerated. While scientists previously estimated temperatures would increase by 2050, in 2042, the actual figure was 3.9 degrees increased. As temperatures rose, heat waves and droughts became the standard. Control measures emerged to assist with water, food, and population rationing. Wealthy countries reacted by moving from tornado and hurricane-prone areas, placing increased social pressure on areas less likely for those hazards. Poorer areas in Africa and Asia fared worse and faced malnutrition, starvation, outmigration, and infertility. In 2041, unprecedented heat waves hit the planet and destroyed crops. Panic and food riots became common. In search of food and shelter, people set out to find new lives. However, migration had issues as well. Mass migration of undernourished, dehydrated individuals, in conjunction with increased insect populations, led to outbreaks of cholera, yellow fever, and viral infections on an unprecedented scale. As social order broke down, governments were overthrown, starting in Africa, then Asia, and then Europe. In reaction, the US and Canada announced plans for a combined nation in order to engage in resource sharing and population rationing. Similar agreements in the European Union took place as well. During the scramble, Switzerland and India began the first International Emergency Summit on Climate Change, organized under the rubric of Unified Nations for Climate Protection. To deal with the rising temperature, the conference prepared blueprints and international climate cooling engineering projects. As a first step, they began with the Crutzen project. The project involved injecting submicrometer-sized sulfate particles into the stratosphere at the rate of 2.0 teragrams per year, which decreased temperatures by 0.1 degrees Celsius each year. While the project was successful for a period of time, it triggered a catastrophic failure by shutting down the Indian Ocean monsoons. It decreased radiation, but in the process, it also decreased evaporation that triggered the rains. When officials closed the project, they faced termination shock, a rapid rise in temperature that resulted in a mean average temperature increase of 5 degrees Celsius. By 2060, Arctic summer ice was gone, and many species became extinct, including the polar bear. In addition to this visible loss, scientists began to notice that Arctic permafrost was melting and releasing Arctic methane into the atmosphere. This melting led to a rise of 1,000 gigatons of CH4, doubling the level of carbon in the atmosphere in a process known as the Venusian death. The massive carbon release led to an additional increase of 6 degrees Celsius in mean planetary temperatures. The final blow for Western civilization came from the collapse of the West Antarctic ice sheet. As extreme heat triggered disruption in normal ocean circulation, warm surface waters entered the Southern Ocean and destabilized the sheet of ice from below. Sea levels rose from 2073 to 2093. 90% of the ice sheets broke apart, disintegrated, and melted, driving up sea levels 5 meters. A similar fate awaited the Greenland ice sheet, adding another 2 meters of global sea level. After ocean levels rose, 1.5 billion people were displaced either directly by the new sea level or the after effects. In addition, displacement gave rise to a second Black Death, killing as many as half the population. Humans weren't the only ones to suffer, as 60 to 70% of species were driven to extinction.
While everyone is now gone, I am still here. Here I stand. Here I have stood since it all began. I have watched the rise and fall of Western civilization with my roots deep in the ground. From the people and their political systems to the decisions that they made, one thing is clear. Human beings were in control of their own destiny, but they failed. They failed to make the right decisions. Their economic and political structures grew too large to combat. In the end, Western civilization was not sustainable, and as a result, it ended, leaving all of this in its path.